She begged for food. She cried out in pain. She whispered for someone, anyone, to save her. But no one came. For over 3 months, a 16-year-old girl was starved, tortured, and degraded in a suburban home, while neighbours, classmates, and even her own sister were too afraid or too indifferent to stop it. Her name was Sylvia Likens, and this is one of the most horrifying true crime stories you'll ever hear, and you won't forget her name after this. Sylvia Likens was a 16-year-old girl, and her younger sister Jenny was 15. They were 2 of 5 children born to Lester and Betty Likens. Sylvia was a typical teenager. She was confident, outgoing, and a huge fan of the Beatles. She even had a nickname, Cookie, and she was pretty but always kept her mouth closed when she smiled because she was missing a front tooth. Jenny, on the other hand, was shy and had a limp from polio. Sylvia was fiercely protective of Jenny, always making sure that Jenny felt included and cared for. The Likens family was far from perfect. Lester and Betty fought often, and their constant moving from town to town following Lester's unstable jobs made stability impossible. By 1965, Lester was working in a carnival, which meant that the family moved frequently, and that summer everything fell apart. Betty, the girl's mother, told Sylvia and Jenny that she would be leaving Lester, their father. Shortly after, Betty, Sylvia and Jenny left their apartment and headed to a local store where Betty was arrested for shoplifting. The police took Betty away and then just left Sylvia and Jenny alone in the store. With only a little money their own mother had gave them, the 2 teenage girls were suddenly on their own as Lester was not currently home and was working away. Desperate and unsure of where to go, Sylvia and Jenny went to a friend's house, Darlene Maguire, who lived nearby. There they met Paula Baniszewski, a teenage girl from the neighbourhood. Paula introduced them to her mother, Gertrude Baniszewski. At first, Sylvia and Jenny didn't notice anything unusual about the Baniszewskis. Gertrude even invited the girls to stay for dinner. Gertrude said only Jenny could stay overnight, but Jenny refused to stay if Sylvia wasn't allowed to. So Gertrude relented and both girls stayed. But right from the start, Gertrude did seem off, especially towards Sylvia. That night, the girls stayed late, celebrating the 10th birthday of Gertrude's daughter Shirley. Around midnight, Sylvia and Jenny's father Lester and their older brother arrived at Gertrude's house looking for Betty, Sylvia and Jenny's mother. Lester explained that he and Betty had to leave town as he was going to manage food stands at the carnival. Betty and Lester were planning to take Jenny and Sylvia along with their other children to their grandmother's house in Indiana. But Gertrude saw an opportunity. Since the girls were already friends with her daughter Paula, Gertrude offered to take them in herself for just $20 a week. After discussing it with Betty, the Likens agreed to the arrangement. Lester handed Gertrude the first $20 and told her to keep the girls in line, using a firm hand if necessary. Sylvia and Jenny were happy with the setup and the first week went smoothly. But to truly understand what happened next, we need to take a closer look at Gertrude, who she was, and the life that shaped her. Gertrude Van Fossman was born on September the 22nd, 1929, to Hugh and Molly Van Fossman. She was the 3rd of 6 children born into the harsh world of the Great Depression, a time when money was scarce, food was rationed, and families often struggled just to survive. But for Gertrude, survival at home was a battle of a different kind. Her mother, Molly, was known to be warm and affectionate with her other children, but when it came to Gertrude, there was a noticeable absence of tenderness. No comforting words, no soft embraces, just coldness. And that coldness spread. Her siblings followed, treating Gertrude as an outsider in her own family. She wasn't just ignored, she was emotionally isolated. Gertrude's father, Hugh, wasn't perfect. Like many men trying to cope with the crushing weight of poverty, he turned to alcohol. He drank too much, too often. But he did notice Gertrude. She was his favourite, the only one he truly seemed to connect with. And for a lonely little girl growing up in a house that treated her like she didn't belong, that bond mattered. It was fragile, yes, but it was real, and it was just enough to keep Gertrude going. However, when Gertrude was just 11 years old, the only source of comfort in her life, her father, was suddenly taken from her. They were sitting together one day reading, something they often did, when Hugh suddenly began to gasp for air. At first, Gertrude didn't understand what was happening. She watched, frozen in place, as he clutched his chest, stood up, and then collapsed to the floor. In a panic, she dropped to her knees beside him, begging him to wake up, calling his name, but he just didn't respond. Then her mother, Molly, came rushing into the room, and instead of comforting her grieving daughter, she accused her of doing something, of causing it. But Gertrude had done nothing wrong. Hugh had died of a massive heart attack right there in front of her. She had watched the only person who had ever truly shown her love die in her arms. And from that moment, something inside Gertrude broke. She was devastated, not just by the loss, but by the way she lost him. The trauma of witnessing at first hand, the helplessness, the blame. She began to suffer from night terrors, waking up in the middle of the night, screaming, crying, begging for help in her sleep. But Molly didn't hold her. She didn't reassure her. She didn't even acknowledge her pain. Instead, she blamed her daughter for disturbing the household, for waking the other children, for being a nuisance. And so, the message to young Gertrude was clear. Your pain doesn't matter. Your grief, it's inconvenient, and your suffering is your own fault. There was no reprieve for Gertrude, not even at school. The children there weren't just classmates, many of them were neighbours and family friends, kids of the very adults who whispered behind closed doors. And they parroted the same cruel things they heard at home. They bullied Gertrude relentlessly, calling her names, spreading rumours that she was promiscuous, dirty, unworthy, but she was still just a child. But those labels stuck, and over time they started to shape the way Gertrude saw herself. The more she was excluded, the more she began to seek out attention that had always been withheld from her. Eventually, she dropped out of school. But the rumours didn't stop. In fact, they followed her. Other teens, mostly boys, sought her out not because they cared about who she was, but because of what they'd heard. The whispers, the stories about her being promiscuous. And that led her to John Baniszewski. It was 1945. Gertrude was just 16 years old when she met John, an 18-year-old police deputy, and they got married that same year. John had heard the stories too, and by his own admission, he expected something very different from his young bride, but he was surprised. He would later describe Gertrude as emotionally detached, claiming that she would lie there like a corpse whenever he tried to be intimate. In reality, Gertrude may have had a reputation, but it wasn't grounded in truth. What she really carried into the marriage was trauma, neglect, and a desperate need to be loved. She was a child trying to play the role of a wife, and she struggled. By most accounts, Gertrude was not a natural homemaker. She burned meals, she couldn't keep a tidy house, and she was inexperienced in nearly every way. But she tried. And honestly, she was just 16 years old. 3 years into their marriage, in 1948, Gertrude gave birth to her first child, Paula. For a moment, it looked like Gertrude might finally have the chance to rewrite her story, to become the kind of mother that she never had, to do things differently. 2 years later, Stephanie was born. But shortly after Stephanie's birth, Gertrude suffered what was then diagnosed as a nervous breakdown. Doctors labelled it neuroticism, a term commonly used in the 1950s to describe emotional instability, anxiety, and extreme mood swings. Today, that diagnosis would more likely fall under borderline personality disorder or bipolar disorder. But back then, there was no real understanding of what she was going through, and even less in the way of treatment. No therapy, no medication, no support, just a label and silence. And despite everything, despite her mental health spiralling and her emotional distance from John, the couple went on to have 2 more children, John Jr. and Marie. By this point, Gertrude was raising 4 children, and she clung to one goal with an obsessive determination. She would not be like her mother. She gave her children the attention she never got. She stayed physically present. She did the feedings, the bathings, the day-to-day tasks. On the surface, she was everything Molly hadn't been, but deep down, Gertrude was unravelling. As the years went on, John became increasingly frustrated with his marriage. Gertrude, despite her struggles, was a dedicated mother. She kept the children clean, fed and close, but as a wife she fell short of John's expectations. Emotionally withdrawn, often disconnected, still grappling with her own internal chaos. And John didn't handle it with patience or compassion. Instead, he turned violent. He began taking his frustrations out on Gertrude physically, a dangerous game for any man, but especially for someone who worked in law enforcement. And of course, as a police officer, John knew exactly what was at stake if word got out. So he forced Gertrude to hide the bruises, with clothing, with makeup, with silence, and Gertrude complied. She stayed quiet, she covered her injuries, she protected his reputation even when he gave her nothing in return. But by 1955, after 10 years of marriage, Gertrude had reached her limit. She asked John for a divorce. The marriage had been long since collapsed under the weight of unmet needs, untreated illnesses and unspoken violence, and now Gertrude was a single mother of 4. With 4 children and no financial security, Gertrude found herself in a vulnerable position. She was quick to settle down again, but this time her choice would prove even more damaging. During a brief stay in Kansas, Gertrude married Edward Guthrie, an unemployed alcoholic with a deep dislike for children. Gertrude and Edward relied almost entirely on John's child support payments, supplemented by money Gertrude earned doing odd jobs whenever she could find work. But Edward's frustration with the constant presence of Gertrude's children grew, and it wasn't long before that frustration turned to violence. On at least one occasion, Edward struck one of the children, and with that, less than a year after their marriage, Gertrude and Edward were divorced. And for Gertrude, the hope for stability and support had once again been crushed. Gertrude was lonely, ashamed too. Being a single mother in that era wasn't easy, especially for someone who had always struggled to find her place. After her divorce from Edward, she ran into John again, the same man who had already been abusive during their first marriage. And almost immediately, they reconnected. Without much hesitation, the couple remarried, because that seemed like another really good idea at the time. Gertrude returned to her role once more, the devoted, dutiful housewife and mother. She threw herself into the routines of cooking, cleaning and caring for her children, hoping to keep the fragile peace. John seemed pleased. For a time he treated her with more kindness than he had before. There was a tentative calm in their home, a fragile truce that neither dared to disturb. But that calm was shattered when tragedy struck. Gertrude suffered a miscarriage. She was nearly full term, almost ready to welcome their 5th child into the world, and the loss was obviously devastating. Not only did she grieve the child that she would never hold, but the loss reopened wounds that had never fully healed. The weight of the miscarriage pushed her into a deep, relentless depression. She withdrew further, retreating into herself, emotionally distant, fragile, and overwhelmed. Her world, which was already fragile, seemed to crumble. And while John's behaviour improved for a time, the shadow of that loss and of Gertrude's mental state would linger long after, because after the miscarriage, everything started to unravel. The house fell into chaos, filthy and neglected. The children were running wild, out of control, no structure or discipline to hold them together. John's patience wore thin. Frustrated and angry, he went back to his old ways, physically abusing Gertrude, trying to force her to snap back to the woman that he wanted her to be. Shockingly, it didn't work. She didn't recover, she didn't change. The violence only deepened the cracks, and it was a bad situation for everybody. And yet, amidst the turmoil, the one thing that brought Gertrude any joy, any momentary peace, was her pregnancies and her children. But even that happiness was fleeting. Over the next 7 years, Gertrude suffered several more miscarriages, each loss adding to the weight that she carried. But then she was blessed with 2 rainbow babies, children born after loss and grief. First came Shirley, the 5th, and then James, the 6th, and for a time their arrival brought a flicker of hope. But children were never the solution to the problems beneath the surface. Gertrude and John's marriage was once again on the rocks, fractured by unresolved pain, unhealed wounds, and a history neither of them could outrun. After nearly 2 decades of marriage, filled with highs and devastating lows, John finally filed for divorce in 1963. Along with that, Gertrude, once a loving mother, began to change. On one occasion, she hit Paula right in front of John. John was shocked and it was unacceptable to him, but Gertrude stood her ground and told him, "I will hit her any time, any way or any place that I please." Gertrude had spent so long trying not to be like her mother, but life took turns that she never expected, and slowly, painfully, she became exactly what she feared. She became her mother, but worse. Eventually, Gertrude met her next man of the hour, Dennis Lee Wright. He was, like so many before him, an alcoholic. He put cigarettes out on her arms and neck, leaving cruel burning marks. But Gertrude charmed Dennis enough for him to support her and her children. One night, she told Dennis the 7th child was on the way. Dennis panicked and became furious. He didn't want to marry her or settle down. In a violent rage, he punched her in the face, then in the stomach. The very next day, Gertrude miscarried again. Despite everything, Gertrude decided to stay with Dennis. And when she became pregnant again, this time she kept the news to herself, waiting until it was too late to turn back. Dennis appeared resigned, reluctantly accepting what was coming. But the real shock came when Gertrude brought their newborn son, Dennis Wright Jr., home, and Dennis was gone. He disappeared without a trace. And he wasn't the only one that left Gertrude behind. Her eldest daughter, Paula, had fled too, running away to Kentucky with a married man. Alone again once more, Gertrude faced the chaos of her fractured family, abandoned and struggling to hold it all together. And Gertrude did not handle abandonment well. To avoid the shame, though it wasn't her fault, she told people that Dennis was off in the military serving for his country. There was an unspoken weight to it all, the stigma of being a single mother in those times, the burden of multiple failed marriages. It crushed her. And this was the moment when Gertrude hit rock bottom. At 5'6", she wasted away to barely 100 pounds. Gertrude's mood didn't improve when her daughter Paula came back home 2 months pregnant and rejected by the married man she'd ran off with to Kentucky. Paula's choices just seemed to echo the same patterns, caught in a cycle of pain and poor decisions. Gertrude's world was unravelling, but she needed something to hold on to, something to channel her energy, and then something came unexpectedly. Paula soon brought home 2 young girls, Sylvia and Jenny Likens. Sylvia and Jenny Likens arrived at the Baniszewski house with nothing more than clothes on their back and hopes in their hearts. Their father Lester handed Gertrude a crisp $20 bill, the first instalment for their care, and then he was gone. Just like that, he left his daughters in the hands of a woman they barely knew. What the Likens didn't realise, what they couldn't have known, is that during the initial visit they had only seen the living room. The rest of the house told a very different story. Behind that front door was a world of quiet desperation. The Baniszewski home, now bursting with 9 mouths to feed, had no working cooker and just 3 spoons to share among them. Before long, even that dwindled down to a single spoon. 1 spoon for an entire household. There were more children than beds and barely enough food to even get them through the day. Gertrude was coming undone. She was working 16-hour shifts, exhausted, beaten down by life, drowning in bills and responsibilities. Taking in Sylvia and Jenny was meant to be a solution, an easy way to bring in a few extra dollars. Just enough to breathe a little easier. At least that's what she told herself. But instead of easing her burden, the presence of 2 more children only magnified her stress. The money wasn't worth it, not to her, not anymore. When Lester's payment didn't arrive on time, something inside Gertrude snapped. Rage bubbled to the surface. She dragged Jenny upstairs and slapped her hard across the face. "I took care of you 2 bitches for a week for nothing," she screamed. The payment did, however, come the next morning, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done, and that moment was a warning, a flicker of the cruelty that was yet to come, a glimpse of how close Gertrude was to the edge. A couple of weeks later, Lester and Betty Likens came to visit their daughters. Sylvia and Jenny said nothing about the slap, about the hunger, about the tension that hung in the air like smoke. They kept it all inside. Before leaving, Lester mentioned they could collect empty bottles from the park for pocket money, and the girls did just that, and brought some of Gertrude's children along with them. But Gertrude did not see this as a kind gesture. She saw it as an insult, because in Gertrude's eyes, the Likens girls were making her children look bad, walking around the neighbourhood picking up garbage like beggars. Her pride flared and her temper boiled. She needed to reassert control to remind everybody whose house it was, and so she decided to punish Sylvia and Jenny once again. The punishments started quickly and they were cruel. Gertrude didn't just yell or scold, she used a thick black leather belt, once owned by her ex-husband John Sr., and a heavy wooden fraternity paddle, nearly a 1/4 inch thick. Instruments of discipline turned into weapons. She struck Sylvia in the back of the head with the paddle, hard, no warning, no mercy, just raw, brutal force. And it didn't stop there. It became a routine, a terrifying, twisted ritual. Gertrude's own health was declining, her lungs weakened by chronic illness, leaving her breathless and frail, so sometimes she was too exhausted to carry out the beatings herself. But the violence didn't end, it just simply shifted hands. That's when her oldest daughter Paula stepped in. Paula began to take on the role of the enforcer. She hit both Sylvia and Jenny, but more often than not, Sylvia did bear the brunt of it. And Paula didn't hold back, just like her mother. She targeted their heads, striking them with the same wooden paddle. And the thing with that is, a blow to the head like that, it isn't just abuse, it crosses into something darker, something potentially lethal. And all of this, the cruelty, the violence, unfolded within the first month of the girls living there. But it wasn't all darkness. At least, not yet. There were rare flickering moments of normalcy, times when Paula and the girls actually got along. Stephanie, Gertrude's second daughter, showed genuine kindness to Sylvia and Jenny, and sometimes they'd all go to the park together, and every Sunday they'd attend church without Gertrude. Those church visits were sacred in more ways than one. After Mass, the girls could breathe, they could laugh. They even got to share a meal. It was one of the few places they were treated like human beings. Everyone in the house, except Paula, seemed to show a glimpse of faith or at least restraint. But then, one Sunday, Paula arrived at church with a cast on her wrist. And when somebody asked what happened, she didn't hesitate. In fact, she bragged. She said she'd broken it by punching Sylvia in the chin, that she'd tried to kill her because Sylvia had been nasty. The comment was shrugged off, laughed at, dismissed, and from that point forward, Gertrude no longer needed a reason to punish Sylvia. In fact, she started to invent reasons. Sylvia very quickly became the household scapegoat, the target of Gertrude's rage, frustrations and delusions. Jenny, meanwhile, lived in silent terror. She couldn't fight back, she couldn't defend Sylvia, and she could only watch. The beatings grew more frequent, more sadistic. Gertrude used belts, paddles, her fists, anything she could find. Sometimes the accusations were absurd. Sylvia was beaten for supposedly stealing $1 from Gertrude's purse. Another time, she was accused of taking too much food at a church potluck, even though she barely ate at all. And of course, none of it was true. But, once again, the truth did not matter in that house. Gertrude began calling Sylvia names, cruel, demeaning things meant to strip her of her dignity. Gluttonous pig, she would sneer, as if that justified starving and humiliating her. Then came one of the most revolting, degrading incidents of all. Gertrude and Paula, alongside a local neighbourhood boy, concocted a punishment disguised as some kind of joke. They smeared a hot dog with every condiment and spice they could find: ketchup, mustard, pepper, chili powder, until it was a nauseating mess nobody could stomach. And then they forced it into Sylvia's face, laughing as she gagged. And if you thought that was cruel, well, it didn't stop there. In a horrifying moment, Gertrude shoved her fingers down Sylvia's throat, trying to force her to swallow the concoction. Sylvia choked and gagged, struggling not to vomit. But her body couldn't take it, so she threw up right there on the floor. Still, Gertrude wasn't done. She demanded Sylvia finish the hot dog. And when Sylvia couldn't, Gertrude forced her to her knees and made her lick her own vomit off the floor. By then, Sylvia was more than just a victim of physical abuse. She was being stripped of her humanity piece by piece. No one stepped in and nobody stopped it, and Sylvia endured it all alone, because that house had become a prison. And for Sylvia, it was quickly becoming a nightmare that she could not wake up from. After the revolting hot dog incident, there was a brief, eerie calm. Paula and Gertrude seemed to ease up on Sylvia, at least on the surface. It felt like a reprieve, but underneath it all, the tension still simmered, waiting for its next excuse to erupt. And that excuse came one ordinary afternoon. They were all sitting together, talking about boys, laughing, almost like normal teenagers. Then Gertrude turned to Sylvia, her tone casual but loaded. She asked if Sylvia had ever done anything with a boy. Sylvia, still clinging to a shred of trust, answered honestly. She spoke softly about parties and innocent dates, and then, almost shyly, she admitted that once, just once, her boyfriend had kissed her and touched her body. It was a quiet, vulnerable confession. But Gertrude didn't see innocence. She saw ammunition. Her face twisted into something unrecognisable. Not shock, not concern, just contempt. Gertrude labelled Sylvia as bad, a girl who deserved whatever came next. And what came next was horrifying. Gertrude declared without any real reason that Sylvia must be pregnant from that one kiss, that her belly was getting fat. Sylvia tried to laugh it off, brushing it away like it was just another of Gertrude's cruel jokes. But it wasn't a joke. And without warning, Gertrude knocked Sylvia to the ground and stomped on her groin, screaming the word whore like it was a curse. Paula joined in, unleashing a beating, and still Sylvia stayed silent. In late August, Lester and Betty returned to visit their daughters. Not a word of the abuse passed their lips. Instead, they just said that they were hungry, so the family went out to eat as if everything was fine, as if Sylvia wasn't being broken down piece by piece, day after day, behind closed doors. By September, school had started again. Sylvia, who had dropped out of high school the previous January, planned to attend a local technical school. But in a moment of desperation and retaliation, Sylvia did something she couldn't take back. She supposedly spread a rumour that the Baniszewski girls were promiscuous. It was her way of fighting back, a whisper of rebellion in a world where her voice had been silenced. She had probably just had enough. But, of course, that came at a cost. Stephanie, Sylvia's only real friend at this point in the house, heard the rumour and was furious. Her anger spilled over and she punched Sylvia in the jaw. And then Stephanie's boyfriend arrived at the house. Without hesitation, he slammed Sylvia's head into a wall. The violence was no longer isolated, it was becoming routine, a ritual, something that everybody was participating in. No one flinched anymore, not even Stephanie. The abuse, once confined to Gertrude and Paula, had spread like wildfire. Now others joined in. It was entertainment, it was a sick game that they all loved to play. When Gertrude heard about the rumour, she didn't just beat Sylvia, she escalated things. She burned Sylvia. With Stephanie's boyfriend standing by, they pressed lit matches against her fingers, watching her skin sizzle, laughing as she screamed. She spread lies, poisoned friendships, and made Sylvia become a pariah at school, at church, in the neighbourhood, even the tech school. Sylvia's final hope slipped away. One evening, a girl named Anna, one of Sylvia's few friends, came to the house. Gertrude met Anna at the door, full of venom, accusing Sylvia of saying horrible things about Anna's mother. Anna stormed in and attacked Sylvia. She punched, kicked and scratched, and when others saw, they all joined in. Even Jenny, Sylvia's own sister, was forced to slap her. And Gertrude made sure that Jenny did this, because she said that if Jenny didn't, then she would be next. So Jenny hit her, and Sylvia, in silence, understood. The abuse had become a spectacle, a performance. At least a dozen local kids had either joined in or watched at this point. Some laughed, some just stood there, but nobody helped. Stephanie, once Sylvia's safe haven, wasn't the same anymore. The trauma had twisted her. She started fainting at school, missing classes. When someone asked if the stress at home was making her sick, she nodded. But instead of breaking free from the horror, Stephanie turned her back on Sylvia too. Now Sylvia was completely alone. Starved and weak, Sylvia's wounds infected and slow to heal, Sylvia began sneaking out at night, searching for scraps of food to survive. But one night she got caught, and Gertrude was waiting. She'd gathered a crowd, her children, neighbourhood boys, even Jenny. Then, holding a glass in her hand, Gertrude issued a command. She told Sylvia to strip and perform. Sylvia stood there, trembling, and in front of that crowd, under the threat of even worse punishment, she obeyed. Because by now, fear ruled every corner of her world. And no one, not one person, stepped forward to save her. The boys cheered and jeered as Sylvia was forced to squat on a glass bottle. And when she didn't move fast enough, Gertrude didn't wait. She shoved her fist forward and forced the bottle deeper inside Sylvia's body. One night, Paula, who had been one of Sylvia's main abusers, did something unexpected. She woke Sylvia, took her downstairs, held the back door open and whispered, "Get out, get away, stay away. It's for your own safety." It could have been a chance, but Sylvia didn't take it. She froze. And after all the trauma, the beatings, the starvation, the constant fear, Sylvia's mind was quite possibly no longer sharp. She was disorientated, weakened, unsure of reality. The constant blows to her head, the starvation, the gaslighting, it had most probably left her confused and afraid to move, so she stayed. On October the 5th, Lester and Betty came back once again to visit the girls. They took the girls out to eat. They told Sylvia and Jenny that carnival season was nearly over. In 3 weeks they'd be back to take them home for good. For Sylvia it was a countdown to freedom. 3 weeks. She just had to make it 3 more weeks. And again, the girls did not mention any of the abuse. And nobody noticed. Not her parents, not a teacher, not a single adult. Neighbours did begin to sense something was wrong. One neighbour saw Sylvia digging through trash cans for food. Another heard some screams, agonising, prolonged screams, coming from the Baniszewski house. But nobody called the police, nobody knocked on the door, no one asked questions. Then a new family moved in next door, the Vermillions. Robert and Phyllis was their 2 young kids. Phyllis worked nights and needed a babysitter. Somebody recommended Gertrude. She had experience after all. So the next morning, Phyllis went to introduce herself. Teenagers loitered around the dining room and then she saw Sylvia. A girl, real thin, with a fresh black eye. Phyllis asked what happened, and Gertrude snarled, glaring across the room at Sylvia. "Get out of my sight, I hate you," she hissed. Then out of nowhere, Paula stood, grabbed a cup of scalding water and hurled it into Sylvia's face. Sylvia screamed. As if to mock her pain, Paula smeared margarine across Sylvia's scalded skin. Phyllis sat frozen, watching, silent. Paula casually mentioned that she was the one who gave Sylvia the black eye, like it was a badge of honour. Gertrude shouted again, threatening to kill Sylvia if she did not leave that room. Phyllis never hired Gertrude, but she didn't report her either. She kept visiting, in fact. On another visit, she saw Sylvia again, this time in worse shape, covered in bruises and busted lips and another black eye. Phyllis asked again what happened. Gertrude said Sylvia had been in trouble and needed to be beaten again. And still, Phyllis said nothing. She'd seen the truth, heard the screams, and did nothing. And she wasn't the only one. Jenny knew then. Her sister's days were numbered. With nowhere left to turn, she risked everything. She smuggled a letter to their older sister, Diana. In it, she begged for help. She described everything Sylvia was enduring. But the truth was too much, and Diana just couldn't believe it. She thought Jenny must have been exaggerating, her imagination running wild. So she threw the letter away, and Sylvia, still alive, still breathing, was left in that house of horrors, alone, afraid, and running out of time. By mid-October, Sylvia had been confined to the basement at this point. Sylvia's world had become a nightmare with no escape. She was no longer treated as a girl or even as a person, just a body, left naked in the frigid darkness of a basement that became her prison. The constant beatings had wrecked her body. Blow after blow to her stomach and groin had damaged her kidneys. She could no longer control her bladder. And when her soiled state became too much for Gertrude to tolerate, she'd summon the neighbourhood boys. They would haul Sylvia upstairs like a sack of garbage and throw her into a scalding hot bath, and she screamed in agony. But the bath wasn't for cleaning, it was just another method of punishment. Afterwards, the boys would line up, each taking a turn at rubbing salt into her wounds. Her meals had dwindled to water and crackers. Sometimes Gertrude allowed her soup, but only if Sylvia ate it with her hands, crouched over the bowl like a dog. Gertrude's hatred simmered without end. She often replayed a moment from back in August when Sylvia had eaten a sandwich while her own children went hungry. Gertrude believed that Sylvia had never been properly punished for that. So one day she told her son Johnny to teach her a lesson. What followed next was unspeakable. Gertrude forced Sylvia to consume the contents of a baby's nappy and gave her a cup of urine. Eventually, Gertrude offered Sylvia a chance to come back upstairs, but there was a condition. She had to stay dry throughout the night. But Sylvia couldn't. Her body had betrayed her a long time ago, and Gertrude knew this. She knew that Sylvia was incontinent. Gertrude also tied Sylvia to the bedpost, so she couldn't even get up to use the bathroom if she wanted to. Predictably, Sylvia wet the bed, and the punishment that followed was even more horrifying than before, if you can believe that. She was dragged back to the basement and was made to repeat the humiliating act Gertrude had forced on her before with a glass soda bottle. Gertrude's cruelty just got sicker and it deepened more. She involved more children in her torment. A neighbourhood boy named Ricky was brought in. Together he and Gertrude used a sewing needle to carve words into Sylvia's skin. Ricky heated the needle until it glowed, branding the message deep into Sylvia's flesh. "I'm a prostitute and proud," it read. Not satisfied with the torment that they'd already caused, they tried to burn an S above the carving with a red-hot crowbar. That night after the torture, Sylvia was tossed onto a mattress. Her younger sister Jenny stayed beside her, trying to offer some comfort in the dark. Sylvia's voice trembled. "I know you don't want me to die," she whispered. "But I'm going to die. I can feel it." Jenny held back tears. "Please," she whispered, "don't die. Stay with me." On October the 24th, Sylvia made a desperate attempt to escape. Her body was failing, but her spirit hadn't completely broken. She reached for the front door, but Gertrude was faster. She dragged Sylvia back in like she was nothing. And now something had shifted in Gertrude. She was uneasy. Sylvia's condition was dire, and maybe, just maybe, Gertrude realised that she had pushed it too far. In a rare gesture, she offered Sylvia a piece of toast, but Sylvia couldn't swallow. Her body was shutting down at this point. Her throat wouldn't cooperate. She tried her hardest to explain to Gertrude she was grateful for the gesture, but she just couldn't do it. But Gertrude's patience snapped. Grabbing a curtain rod, Gertrude beat Sylvia until the rod bent out of shape. The next morning, Jenny tried again to feed her sister. Still, Sylvia couldn't eat. Gertrude gave her milk, but that too came back up. Enraged, she stomped on Sylvia's face. By now, it was clear that Sylvia was dying. Panic began to creep into the house. Gertrude told Jenny to strip Sylvia, then poured laundry detergent all over her body. They scrubbed her with a garden hose, desperate to clean away the truth. Stephanie, one of Gertrude's daughters, returned home and found Sylvia barely conscious. For the first time, she seemed truly horrified. She tried to lift Sylvia upstairs for a real bath. Ricky appeared again, offering help. He cradled Sylvia in his arms, but as they climbed the basement stairs, her limp body slipped. Her head struck the steps with a sickening sound. Still, Gertrude insisted she was faking it and just acting for attention. They did manage to get Sylvia into the bath eventually, and they locked Gertrude out of the room because Gertrude was still insistent on beating Sylvia when she's unconscious. Sylvia lay in the water, barely able to speak. "I wish my daddy was here," she whispered to Stephanie. Stephanie ran her fingers through Sylvia's matted hair as the tears came, silent and heavy. They wrapped Sylvia in warm blankets and laid her in bed, her breath shallow, her skin pale and still. Then Gertrude forced her way in again, her voice sharp and venomous. "She's faking. She's putting on a show," she repeated over and over again. Again, Stephanie pushed her out and locked the door behind her. Sylvia stirred again, and she barely opened her eyes. She looked at Stephanie, her gaze filled with longing and weariness. "Oh, Stephanie," she whispered, "take me home." Those were Sylvia Likens' final words. When everybody realised that Sylvia had lost consciousness at this point, it was Ricky who called the police. But by the time the police arrived at the Baniszewski house, Sylvia Likens was already gone. The cruelty had consumed her. The suffering had ended, but far too late. When the police arrived at the Baniszewski home after Sylvia had already passed away, they were greeted with not grief or shock, but with lies. Gertrude stood at the doorway, composed, spinning a tale that barely made any sense. She claimed Sylvia had run off with a group of teenage boys who had abused her and dumped her at the house in that horrific condition. She even produced a letter allegedly written by Sylvia herself. The letter read, "Mr. and Mrs. Likens, I went with a gang of boys in the middle of the night. They said they would pay me if I would give them something. So I got in the car and they all got what they wanted, and they did this and they did that, and when they were finished they beat me up and left sores on my face and all over my body. They also put on my stomach. I'm a prostitute and proud of it. I've done about everything I could do just to make Gertrude mad, cost her more money than she has. I tore up a new mattress and peed on it. I've also cost Gertrude doctor bills she can't pay and made her a nervous wreck, along with all her kids. I wouldn't do anything around the house. I've done everything I could to make things worse for them." To Officer Melvin Dixon, the first to arrive on the scene, the story felt wrong. The scene, the injuries, the strange behaviour of the household, it all reeked of something far darker. But with everyone inside the home echoing Gertrude's version, there was little to immediately contradict her. About an hour later, Deputy Coroner Dr. Arthur Keeble arrived. One look at Sylvia's body told him everything. Her injuries were grotesque, festering wounds, deep punctures, a massive bruise on her head, and raw patches of skin that looked burnt. It was hard to look at her without feeling sick. No street gang had done this. This had happened inside that house. Dr. Charles Ellis later concluded what Keeble had already suspected. The level of cruelty required to do this was not the work of opportunistic criminals. It was a work of monsters. Everyone, even Jenny, backed Gertrude's story initially. Jenny had been warned by Paula. Paula said to Jenny, "Keep quiet and you'll be treated just like a sister." But as the officers began to leave, something inside Jenny finally broke. She reached out, grabbed one of them by the sleeve and said quietly, "Get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." Jenny was thankfully removed from the house and sent to stay with her older sister Diana. Meanwhile, back in Florida, Lester and Betty Likens were jolted awake by a ringing phone. The news crushed them. Their daughter was dead. With barely enough money, they borrowed what they could to fly to Indiana and identify Sylvia's broken body. Dr. Ellis conducted an autopsy on Sylvia. The truth was even more horrifying than what had been seen at the scene. Sylvia had actually bitten through her own lip, perhaps in pain, perhaps trying not to scream. It was the head injury that was fatal, a subdural hematoma caused by a blunt force trauma. That trauma, it turned out, likely came from her fall down the basement stairs when Ricky dropped her while trying to carry her upstairs to get Sylvia into the bath. As the investigation unfolded, the police began arresting the key players. Gertrude denied everything at first, then she admitted she knew what had happened, but blamed her health, her asthma, her weakness, and her children. Later she did confess to taking part. Paula also confessed, as did her brother Johnny. Stephanie's boyfriend Coy Hubbard was arrested too. Ricky Hobbs, the boy who had tattooed Sylvia's stomach, confessed his role in the abuse. 4 more local teenagers were briefly arrested for participating but were later released due to lack of evidence. Bearing in mind that there were so many children going into the basement, watching the abuse and actively participating in abusing Sylvia like it was some kind of game. By the end of October 1965, 6 people were formally charged: Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, Johnny, Coy Hubbard and Ricky Hobbs. Bail was denied for all. The trial began in 1966 and all defendants were tried together. It was one of the most shocking and highly publicised cases in Indiana. Each defendant had their own attorney, except for Coy and Ricky, who shared legal representation. The courtroom was crowded, the media coverage relentless. Each defence lawyer pointed fingers at the others, trying to shield their own client from blame. Jenny Likens was called to testify. Her voice trembled as she admitted she'd stayed quiet out of fear. Gertrude told her she'd suffer Sylvia's fate if she did speak up. Jenny broke down as she described watching her sister wither, scream, and finally fade. Expert witnesses confirmed the brutality, the scalding baths, the branding, the starvation, and the final trauma that killed her. The jury rejected Gertrude's insanity plea. Her cruelty had been too deliberate and too consistent. Gertrude Baniszewski was convicted of first-degree murder. Paula Baniszewski was convicted of second-degree murder. Johnny Baniszewski was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. Coy Hubbard and Ricky were also convicted of voluntary manslaughter. Stephanie Baniszewski, though initially charged, was released after her lawyer argued her role was minimal. The prosecutor, Leroy New, was so affected by the case that he actually ended up taking Jenny into his home and later formally adopted her. Jenny later said, "I just wish Sylvia and I had been left with kind people like this instead of Gertrude." On May the 24th, 1966, Gertrude began her life sentence. She appealed and she was granted a new trial, but again convicted. This time she was sentenced to 18 years to life. Behind bars, Gertrude reinvented herself. She became a model prisoner, working in the sewing shop and mentoring young inmates. By 1985, she was affectionately called Mum in prison, which I just find absolutely bizarre. Despite public outrage and a petition with more than 4,500 signatures, the parole board did eventually set her free. At Gertrude's parole hearing, she claimed, "I'm not sure what role I had. I was on drugs. I never really knew Sylvia, but I take full responsibility for whatever happened to her." She changed her name to Nadine Van Fossen, moved to Iowa, and died of lung cancer in 1990 at the age of 60. Paula also appealed her conviction. Her conviction was actually overturned due to the prejudice of the joint trial. Before her retrial, she accepted a plea deal for voluntary manslaughter and served just 3 years in prison. Years later, in 2012, she was discovered working under a false name as a teacher's aide. She was working with children. When her true identity was uncovered, she was immediately fired. Johnny Baniszewski, Coy, and Ricky each sentenced to 18 months in a juvenile detention. Ricky suffered a mental breakdown after his release. Haunted by what he'd done, he died of lung failure at just 20 years old. Coy Hubbard married, had 5 children, and died in 2007. And Johnny Baniszewski passed away in 2005. Jenny Likens found peace in her adult life. She married, raised 2 children, and remained in Beech Grove, Indiana until her death in 2004. I don't think she spoke much after the trial about how she was coping publicly, but I do wonder if after she had children, it made her understand the full weight of what had actually been done to Sylvia. In 2001, the city of Indianapolis honoured Sylvia with a permanent memorial in Willard Park, a 6-foot granite stone dedicated to the memory of abused children. It stands not far from the site of her death. The house on East New York Street where Sylvia was tortured was demolished in April 2009. The murder of Sylvia Likens wasn't just a crime. It was a complete failure of society, community, and compassion. Multiple people saw warning signs or heard them, but nobody took meaningful action. Sylvia never got to grow up, graduate, or have a family of her own. Her story reminds us that silence is very dangerous sometimes, and that speaking up might be the difference between life and death for a vulnerable child. I think this tragedy did take place in a time where people were raised to just mind their own business, when children were told that they should be seen and not heard, when it was appropriate to punish children physically. I think what happened to Sylvia started to shift that mindset, with it being highly publicised. It started to open up people's eyes to the horrors that happen behind closed doors, and that it isn't always appropriate to keep yourself to yourself and mind your own business and look the other way. But it should never have got to the point that it did. I think society today does actually take the stance that it's so important to report things that don't sit right with you, especially if you ever suspect that a child's been abused, rather than assuming that somebody else will report it and that it's somebody else's job to do that. But that still doesn't always happen, and so it's important to keep the conversation alive and keep reminding people to take action rather than assuming somebody else will. Sylvia's voice was taken away. She couldn't protect herself from the mob that attacked her relentlessly. She couldn't break the pack mentality they had, thinking that Sylvia deserved it. Nobody spoke up for her. Neighbours looked away. Authorities didn't question it. But we can be the voice for all of the other Sylvias today, for all of the children that are living in fear right now.